Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Joe. A brilliant discussion. If you want to continue following up with Bain, do check out the virtual exhibition and the networking tab. Moving on, however, I would like to pass to Al Carnrite, CEO and founder of the Carnrite Group, to discuss carbon pricing as we move through this energy transition. Al, over to you.
Thank you, Owen. Appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. We've got a great set of panelists here for this session. We have Lord Adair Turner. Adair chairs the Energy Transition Commission, pardon me. Joanna Freitas, Joanna is executive board member of EDP Produção, and we've got Kentaro Kawamari, who's the CEO of and co-founder of Persephone. So we've got some varied backgrounds and experts in their field to address this today, and we've got a 30-minute panel, so we're going to get right to it. First question is for all three of you to respond to it. Just spend a couple minutes each if you could. And that is, how do you see the energy transition landscape? And how does the landscape differ across the globe? Adair, you want to go first?
Thank you, Alan. I think the interesting thing is that we know the key features of how to get to a zero carbon economy by mid-century, which is what we need to do. And at the absolute core of that is electrification. So in the Energy Transition Commission, we believe that the direct use of electricity could go from around 20% of final energy demand today to, say, 60% or even more by 2050. International Energy Agency in its latest net zero report is a little bit less than us, about 50%, but they used to be about 30 or 40% in their scenarios. I think everybody, every time they revisit their scenarios, realizes even more that electricity is the absolute core, and that the crucial thing we need to do to get to a zero carbon economy is electrify as much of the economy as possible and decarbonize electricity production as fast as possible. And the good news is that because of the collapsing costs of wind and solar and batteries and hydrogen, we increasingly know how to run low-cost, zero-carbon electricity systems, which will probably depend primarily on intermittent renewables, and we know how to balance the system. So that, I think, is the big common story across the world. But then, of course, you get differences according to the natural resources. If you go to India, the core of a decarbonized power system will be solar. In the UK, the core will be offshore wind in the North Sea. So the natural resource balance pushes us in different directions, also suggests a somewhat different residual role for either fossil fuels with CCS or bioenergy. But the common feature across the world is lots more electricity and lots more renewables.
Thank you, Adair. Joanna, would you like to add to that, please?
Sure. Thank you, Alan. Pleasure to be here. Well, what is the energy transition? It is really just reducing emissions by moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy, notably wind and solar. And while we keep talking about gigatons of CO2 and degrees of increasing temperatures on Earth, I think it's important to remember that these are all just proxies for quality of life, right? What we're really talking about are safe, healthy lives, continued livelihoods, and stable, rich ecosystems. Now, if you work in the power sector and in Europe like I do, you tend to be optimistic about the state of the energy transition because Europe and power generation are at the forefront of this shift. If we look at Europe and its climate targets, Europe has been over-delivering on its climate targets for the past 20 years. It started with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, when it reduced emissions by 18% by 2012, when the target was 8. And then in 2007, when the European Commission set a target to reduce 20% of emissions by 2020, but then when we got to 2018, it had already achieved the milestone. Now, Europe, of course, is responsible for under 10% of global emissions, so it has a modest impact on the overall account of emissions. But I do think it can have a ripple effect worldwide, both because it can drive changes in consumer behavior, but also pent-up demand and in turn reduce costs for nascent technologies that will be needed for the transition to be successful. Likewise, power generation and heating are only responsible for about a quarter of emissions, but because the power sector started decarbonizing in the 1990s and it uses more mature technology, it's likely to get to net zero emissions much sooner than other sectors like agriculture or transport or heavy industry. In fact, some analysts consider it will get there by a full decade before these other sectors. And indeed, in EDP, we've made the commitment to get to net zero by 2030, so ahead of national targets. So if for a minute, I think also about what's happening outside Europe, it's important to remember that coal is still the dominant energy source worldwide. It's over 60% of the energy mix in 2019. And although we've seen a lot of net zero pledges recently, so about 70% of emissions are now covered by jurisdictions that have made pledges to get to net zero emissions at some point. What the IEA projected in its recent outlook was that if you take all the stated policies today and you project them into the future, we don't get to 1.5 degrees. So even though we have a high level of ambition, that is not enough. And now, of course, we've had a couple of weeks ago, we had the G7 summit in Cornwall. G7 leaders made a commitment to end coal in their respective countries and to set up a $2.8 billion fund to help developing countries do the same. These are positive steps, but if you put it in context, globally, governments annually get about 44 billion of carbon revenue. So we're collecting 44 billion of US dollars every year of carbon taxes and pricing. And we're saying, you know, the G7 will set up a fund of 2.4 billion. So that's not very significant. I think we need to do more and faster, and we do indeed need to be at war with carbon.
Thank you, Joanna. Quintero, you want to add some more to this conversation, please?
Sure, Al. I'll add a little bit of a contrary view. I think we spend a lot of time in these type of forums talking about electrification. We talk about the decarbonization of the power sector, but I think that topic is pretty well worn at this point. You know, the power and utility sector, whether it's here in the U.S. or as Joanna just mentioned, as part of the G7 movements, is largely going to be decarbonized. Also, not just because of regulation, but thanks to just unit economics. You know, you see attendees and speakers from this forum, from BP to Shell, investing aggressively in the power sector simply because it's the right business decision over time. I think the energy transition discussion is only starting to realize that we need to focus on things like distribution of power to ensure that it's getting to the right places, and that's why the hydrogen conversation keeps picking up. And so figuring out how the fossil fuel sector exactly can contribute in the right way to greener, more portable energy, not just things like gray hydrogen, which is just transforming and translating the carbon from one high emissions activity to another, are critical. But just as importantly, all of the derivative products from the fossil fuel industry that permeate everything from consumer packaged goods to you know, the way we power data centers, for example, beyond just electrification. You know, I think it's certainly time to take a closer look, and the greater business opportunities, in my perspective, are going to come from those sectors that aren't seeing as much attention to them on that space. And if we look at the other elephant in the room, you know, the agricultural sector beyond power generation, it certainly is right in line with that, and certainly needs more attention, if you ask me, because of the indirect components of the energy transition in that sector, like deforestation, for example. So I think energy transition as a whole is transforming as a topic to go what was previously very focused on the fossil fuel sector, and certainly will have now impacts far beyond that in terms of one-time use products and its permeability throughout the economy.
Thanks, Quintero. Thanks everybody. This next one's rather a yes or no, I think. Can we meet the Paris Agreement without some kind of a carbon price on a global basis? Do we need some kind of a system to incentivize the right behaviors? And Joanna, maybe you could take that first.
Sure. I think we do need a carbon price mechanism to get to our climate goals. I mean, if you think about it, if our goal is to get to net zero emissions by 2050, that's a massive shift. That means all sectors and all geographies need to be net zero. Carbon pricing is not the only lever to get to this goal, but it is an important lever. And frankly, we need all the levers that we can mobilize. Now, thinking of that, all the sectors and all the geographies, currently the European trading system covers about half of the emissions of the continent. We have to extend it to all sectors to make this goal attainable. Currently, things like steel, cement, and chemicals, they have more free allocations than their verified emissions in the last 5 years. So I think in the revision of the system that is upcoming this next month, we should see some changes to that. Thinking of all geographies, according to the World Bank, carbon pricing mechanisms now cover about 20% of global emissions. So that means that 80% of global emissions are not covered by any mechanism. So that's important that comes to happen. And if I can add a sort of a first-person account, if you will, earlier this year, we've shut down the largest coal power plant in Iberia. And of course, this is aligned with our commitment to end coal by 2025 in EDP. But what's interesting is that prior to the decision to shut down the plant was inactive for over 12 months. And this was largely because it stopped being competitive to bid in the market, and to a great extent that was due to carbon-specific taxation it was subjected. So carbon pricing does work. It drives decisions, economic decisions in the right direction, and I think it's a very important pillar of this path we're in.
Thank you. Quintero, you want to add anything to that, please?
Yeah, I think there certainly has to be mechanisms for incentives, and the carrot and stick sort of system, so to speak. But I think incentives most of the time tend to be more powerful. It is the primary reason that the renewable sector is taking off like it is. It's simply more economical and a higher return activity to be able to do that. We saw at a global scale, nationalism take hold again, throughout the world in a phenomenally swift period of time. And so political leaders and global leaders are going to revert, we've seen proven, to protecting their own constituencies, and oftentimes protecting their own constituencies does not line up with the global climate agenda. And one could certainly make the argument at times it shouldn't when you're looking at constituencies that are running without power and reliable access to utilities. So who is to say that they should not have access to energy in various forms or fashion? I certainly won't take a stance on this call. I think you have to consider both sides of it. I think much of the rhetoric is cited to extremes, but I think the one constant is human psychology and human politics certainly dictates that there has to be a strong system for incentive and for punitive measures where appropriate. Now, I will say, I think we're seeing that sort of emerge in pockets in the US and in the EU, specifically around the movement around institutional investors. Is it enough? No, but the incentives that are existing for companies to do things like issuing sustainability-linked bonds, for example, certainly is driving activity. Again, it's not perfect. There's a long ways to go on those, but even as recently as yesterday, I found myself speaking with one of the world's largest banks and supporting efforts to help publish the first green IPO. Again, exactly what that looks like, nobody's quite sure yet. But the fact is, progress is being made when there's an incentive being offered in the market. And right now that incentive in that space is coming from lower access or access to lower cost of capital. And we have to extend those sorts of incentive schemes to power generators, to sector specific activities like agriculture, And if we do that, we'll certainly see an uptick for it. All that to say, as Joanna mentioned earlier, there's the fact that we still have an enormous amount of coal development globally, and so there are certainly some institutional and global level pushes that have to be made around some of the highest emission activities.
Thank you. Adair, you want to add something to this conversation too, please?
Yeah, I think the most effective policy tools vary by sector. And in that context, I'd just like to go back to something that Joanna and Kantaro said earlier about let's not overstate the importance of electricity, but also don't understate it. Because yes, we know how to get to zero carbon electricity at low cost, but we've got to not only decarbonize the electricity system we've got to drive a huge expansion of the electricity system and of the transmission and distribution system that supports it. Even in rich developed parts of the world like Europe, electricity demand will probably go up 2.5 times. And we can't assume that that scale of development will occur without strong policy levers. And it's interesting, if you then switch to what in the Energy Transition Commission we called the hard to abate sectors when we looked at them in 2017 and 18, steel, cement, shipping, aviation, although it's clear that you can't directly electrify them, actually for many of them you do come back to electricity because hydrogen can be a crucial vector to decarbonize them, can be used as a reduction agent for steel, can be used to produce ammonia to be burned in shipping. And we believe that the cheapest way to produce hydrogen will be in the green route through electrolysis, which means even more electricity. So when we add up all the investment that is needed across the world to drive a zero carbon economy, we actually think about 80% of it is building this bigger green electricity system, and that all the rest, all the new ships, all the new aircraft, all the new steel mills are 20% or so. Now, what you then have to say is, well, okay, where do we need carbon pricing? And I think, interestingly, in the power system, carbon pricing is certainly a nice to have. The carbon price in the UK has helped drive coal out of our system, I think almost as fast as in Portugal. I think it's a competition between the two of us as to who gets there first to close the last coal plant. So it's been useful, but actually in the power system, other levers such as auctions of fixed price contracts have been a more powerful lever, and I think will continue to be. But where I think carbon pricing does become very important is actually in the hard to abate industrial sectors. It's in areas like cement, in steel, in the chemicals area, where there are so many different precise things that industries could do to decarbonize that you want the decentralized power of a carbon price to encourage them to do so. So it's actually in those sectors that we see it as most important. Finally, a comment, Kantaro mentioned the agricultural sector, hugely important, probably something like 1/4 to 1/3 of all our effective emissions when you allow for methane from ruminant animals and land use change driven by the agricultural sector. Though it's true to say that in that area, a carbon price per se won't make all that difference. Maybe we should have a methane tax on red meat, because that's what it would really be. But I think actually the biggest issues there are policies that put an end to deforestation and drive reforestation, which are slightly tangential to the issue of the carbon price. So yes, carbon price, a crucially important issue in many sectors, and in particular, these hard to abate industrial sectors, and maybe the long distance transport sectors like shipping and aviation as well.
Thank you. We've seen two schemes being discussed and implemented. One is the ETS or cap and trade, and the other being a carbon tax. Kantaro, any feel for which one do you think is most effective, or they both get the same outcome?
I think it's exactly what Adair just said. It's not an either or scenario. I think you have to have both, and I completely concur that very stringent focus on the highest emitting sectors like cement and agriculture on the tax side. And that certainly can come in various forms of fashion. That doesn't mean a direct price per carbon or per ton of CO2 equivalent. It certainly means, similar to what we saw the EPA mandate around mine cleanup legislation for the mining sector in the US, for example, a very small example, but forced allocations of capital to clean up mining sites after they're abandoned, similar to what's being considered here in the US for abandoned oil and gas wells by the Biden administration. So there's various forms of the tax that really is about reclamation as much as it is taxing the actual emissions profile. And so I think you have to have both. We've seen sort of the spectacular failures of cap and trade systems throughout the world. And I think certainly for a cap and trade system to work, you need the large global regulatory environments and schemes like the EU and the US eventually to join forces, more specifically probably the G7 as a whole. So I think you can make incremental progress on carbon tax schemes in certain regions. For example, in the US and the EU, there's decarbonization occurring through various other incentive schemes on a state level and at a country level. And so introducing a tax will have some impact, but I don't think as great as some might anticipate. And certainly then again, if you just look at the numbers, there's a much smaller subsector or subsection of sectors that are causing the majority of emissions. And so certainly it comes back to the question of who should carry the biggest burden. The highest emitters should certainly be investing more aggressively to mitigate those emissions.
Joanna, the European Parliament recently backed a carbon border tax to be levied on carbon intensive goods imported into the EU. What's your view as the effectiveness of that, and what unintended consequences could come out of that, if any?
Well, I certainly commend Ursula von der Leyen in her boldness in putting forward that proposal. In fact, next month, the European Commission is set to present the details of how that will work. I think it sends a very strong political message. It's not without its complexity. If you think how you will be implementing this carbon border tax, you need to define which products will be subject to this tax. You need to estimate the carbon content of the product, and of course, supply chains are divided across the globe, so there's complications with this. And then you need to make it compatible with WTO rules and the existing ETS system. So it's not going to be a straightforward instrument. I think it has also an element of danger, right? Because you can trigger a trade war with something like this. But I do think it's a signal in the right direction. The Commission and the Europe wants to be in the right side of history. It wants to protect its industry from an unlevel playing field, from competition where these standards are not so demanding. So I think it's a positive measure, and I'm curious to see how it really comes through in the details.
Thank you. Adair, one of the things that is going to get debated long and hard is we've got the G20 pretty much dictating to the rest of the world what's going to be acceptable. So we've got 1 billion or 1.5 billion people in the G20 talking to 7 billion or 8 billion people around the world. And I've already seen some of the backlash from large countries that don't want to be lectured to on the pace, even if they did sign on to the Paris Accord. What's your view on that, and how do we bring some balance to that discussion?
Well, look, if you take the G7 plus China plus the rest of the rich developed world, let's say OECD plus China, that is the vast majority of emissions, and those are the guys that have to reduce emissions to, make sure that we limit climate change for the benefit of many people in the less developed world. I mean, let's be clear, nobody's asking Niger or Chad to make a commitment to zero carbon at the expense to those economies. Their total emissions at the moment are so trivial, it doesn't make a difference. So it is the rich developed world plus China above all, and then there are a couple of other key countries, Indonesia, India, Brazil, but it's the rich developed world plus China, and China is increasingly a middle and heading towards an upper middle income country that have to take the action. So I don't think there's anything about them taking action which is to the disadvantage of the poor of the rest of the world. And I think that's where we need to concentrate action. I think you want to see those almost together. I mean, obviously there are political antagonisms on other issues between them, but they are all committed to get to zero carbon by mid-century. Basically, all the rich developed economies are heading towards 2050 targets. China has headed to 2060, though we think it would be absolutely possible for them to make that 2050. So I think that is where we really need to concentrate. And I think people they sort of say, well, we're pressuring the poor of the rest of the world to take action. I mean, broadly speaking, that is not true. Nobody is asking the poorest countries of the world to take action, because right at the moment, they have almost no emissions at all. What is important, and if you take, say, Africa, we should be helping Africa to achieve electrification in a right first time fashion without ever going through the fossil fuel phase. And Africa has enormous wind and solar, which would allow that to happen. But the objective there, let's be clear, is that in Africa, it's not that you limit their economic growth or their rise to prosperity. Africa should be using 10 to 15 times as much electricity it does at the moment. But if we get it right, all of that can be zero carbon from the get-go.
Thank you. Joanna, you have any other comments on this topic too, please?
Yes, and absolutely in agreement with what Adair just said. I do think, in coming back to how we're going to build this worldwide consensus around, in particular around carbon pricing, I think we do need China, which is the world's largest emitter, to come on board. I think they are, in fact, in the process of rolling out their own emissions trading program. So that will be an important shift, I think, in the way that emissions are treated. And then I do think that rich nations need to help developing nations to deal with the effects of climate change. As you know, there was a commitment made in 2009 to mobilize $100 billion a year to help developing nations. This was going to be 100 billion every year by 2020. It hasn't happened. And then coincidentally, 100 billion is also the amount of subsidies globally to fossil fuels. So we really need to stop doing that. We have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. It's still happening in massive amounts, and we need to redirect that cash into helping the developing nations deal with the transition.
Thank you. I think we've got about 30 seconds left, but not too much time. Kentaro, anything to add to the final? You got the final voice on this topic.
I'll echo what my fellow panelists said. Is we need to focus on where the primary emissions are coming from, and if you just look at the numbers, we need to fix what China and India are doing. Electrification on the grid is happening in the U.S. and the EU thanks to a whole host of reasons, but still plenty of coal plants going up every day in those two countries, and ironically, both of their populations are disproportionately affected by climate change and the quality of the air they breathe. So there's certainly a big case to be made for them to fix it at home.
Thank you. Thanks to Joanna, Adair, and Kentaro for the discussion. It was very enjoyable, and hopefully everybody listening to this understands some of the macro issues we're dealing with and some of the potential economic incentives that could be put in place. Thank you.
And thank you, Al, and to the Carnrite group as well for their collaborations on this panel. Of course, once again, thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Next, we'd like to pass to Marcus Roremo, CEO of Fortum, to explore a European approach to faster decarbonisation. Marcus, over to you.